September 2025. Donald J. Trump is sitting in the Oval Office as the 47th President of the United States. And maybe you think this whole idea of presidents hating each other, refusing to shake hands, skipping inaugurations, throwing shade, is something new. Oh no, American history is packed with icy standoffs and political ghosting that make today's drama look almost polite. John Adams literally snuck out of Washington at 4 in the morning just to avoid Thomas Jefferson's inauguration. Andrew Johnson sulked in the White House rather than ride with Ulysses Grant. Andrew Jackson swore his wife's death was caused by campaign smears. Theodore Roosevelt, once retired, stormed back into politics just to crush his old friend William Taft. And Herbert Hoover, he had to sit stiffly in a carriage next to Franklin Roosevelt, faces frozen like marble statues while the U.S. banking system collapsed all around them. Here's the kicker. These weren't just petty grudges. What looked like palace drama often shaped national policy, split political parties, and at times even decided the direction of the entire republic. A bruised ego could reshape millions of lives. A nasty campaign ad could redraw the political map. So in this video, we're not marching forward through history. We're rolling it back. We'll start in the present with the Trump-Biden showdown fresh in memory. Then rewind to Obama, Carter, Truman, and keep going until we land in the founding era, where best friends like Adams and Jefferson became bitter rivals. Along the way, you'll see one of history's great paradoxes. Sometimes, presidential hatred moved America forward more powerfully than any law ever could. So buckle up, because we're about to ride the roller coaster of presidential drama, equal parts hilarious, heartbreaking, and occasionally history-shaping. Biden vs. Trump breaking tradition, 2020-2021. January 20, 2021. A freezing wind cut across Washington as Joe Biden took the oath of office. Former presidents lined the stage, wrapped in coats and scarves, embodying that old American ritual of continuity. But one figure was missing, Donald J. Trump. Instead of sitting there to witness his rival sworn in, he boarded Air Force One at dawn and flew south to Florida. For the first time in 152 years, a U.S. president skipped his successor's inauguration. At first glance, you might think, unprecedented, never before. But history nerds know better. Trump wasn't inventing a new tradition. He was reviving an old bad habit. John Adams in 1801 slipped out of D.C. at 4 a.m. just to avoid seeing Jefferson. His son, John Quincy Adams, pulled the same stunt on Andrew Jackson in 1829. And in 1869, Andrew Johnson sulked in the White House rather than escort Ulysses S. Grant. In a sense, Trump was just dusting off a precedent long buried in the attic. The difference: the earlier Adamses and Johnson never challenged the legitimacy of the entire system. Trump did. After losing to Biden by more than 7 million votes, he insisted the election was stolen. On January 6, his supporters stormed the Capitol. So when Trump skipped the inauguration, it wasn't just personal pique. It became the visible symbol of a fractured national faith in democracy itself. Here lies the paradox. America loves to boast about the peaceful transfer of power. Yet that tradition rests on nothing more than the courtesy of the loser. The Constitution doesn't force a handshake or a carriage ride. It's just etiquette. But when the etiquette shatters, the world suddenly sees that this old democracy isn't granite solid. It's fragile, painted over with a thin lacquer of ritual. And that is why January 20, 2021 will be remembered. Not only because Biden became the 46th president, but because another president, Trump, became the most conspicuous absence in the history of American inaugurations. Obama vs. Trump from a joke to a political vendetta, 2011-2018. This story doesn't begin in Congress or the Oval Office. It starts on reality TV. Before he entered politics, Donald Trump was known for skyscrapers, casinos, and The Apprentice. But he also played America's loudest conspiracy theorist, pushing the claim that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. The so-called birther movement grew so loud that in 2011, the White House released Obama's Hawaiian birth certificate. For Trump, of course, that was never enough. Then came the White House Correspondents' Dinner of 2011, a black tie roast where presidents usually poke fun at journalists and colleagues. Obama seized the moment. In front of hundreds of reporters, officials, and celebrities, he played a Lion King clip on the big screen, presenting Simba as his new birth certificate, then locked eyes with Trump in the audience. The ballroom roared with laughter, Trump's face stone cold. Some witnesses later swore that night planted a vow of revenge. Fast forward 7 years and that vow looked fulfilled. When Trump entered the White House in 2017, Obama's legacy became his hit list. The Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, the Affordable Care Act, each one targeted, dismantled, or rolled back. Historians describe it as one of the most aggressive efforts ever to erase a predecessor's mark. Here lies the paradox. What began as a joke at a dinner became the seed of a policy war. American politics, we like to think, is about ideas and constitutional principles. But often it turns on something far more human: ego, pride, and the sting of being humiliated in public. So the Obama-Trump rivalry wasn't just Democrat versus Republican. It was proof that in a democracy, personal grudges can become national policy. Sometimes history isn't written in ink, it's written in punchlines. By 1980, America was exhausted. Inflation was soaring, gas lines snaked around city blocks, and 52 American hostages had been trapped in Iran for over a year. President Jimmy Carter, once a peanut farmer, later a nuclear engineer, tackled every crisis with obsessive detail. He read thick briefing books cover to cover, filled the margins with notes, and micromanaged policy like a straight-A student. The perfect workhorse. But in politics, hard work doesn't always win races. His challenger, Ronald Reagan, was a Hollywood actor turned politician, and he played his role with dazzling ease. On the debate stage, Carter piled up facts and figures, while Reagan just tilted his head, smiled, and quipped, "There you go again." The audience laughed, Carter fumed, and the moment stuck. In the end, Reagan won in a landslide while Carter quietly packed his bags. The contrast only deepened during the transition. Carter pushed for marathon briefings, trying to hand off every detail. Reagan leaned back, barely jotting anything down. At one meeting, Carter snapped when Reagan seemed indifferent to national security reports. For Carter, it was deadly serious. For Reagan, it was just another long lecture. And then fate twisted the knife. Minutes after Reagan took the oath on January 20, 1981, Iran released all 52 hostages. Carter had spent 444 days agonizing over negotiations, but the glory went to Reagan, the smiling newcomer. The hardworking president walked off the stage in silence, while the showman was hailed as a hero. From a historian's lens, the Carter-Reagan clash is a reminder that in a democracy, success isn't measured only by effort. It also hinges on image, performance, and sheer political luck. History, frustratingly, doesn't always reward the hardest worker. And maybe that's why it captivates us. It's full of irony, where a single smile can eclipse a stack of policy papers. LBJ vs. Nixon, from treason to deadly silence, 1968-1974. 1968 was chaos in America. Vietnam dragged on with no end in sight. Anti-war protests filled the streets, and Lyndon B. Johnson, drained after 5 brutal years in office, announced he wouldn't run again. But before leaving the White House, he wanted one last legacy: peace. The Paris peace talks with North Vietnam gave him a sliver of hope. Then came Richard Nixon. Behind the scenes, Nixon's campaign was accused of quietly urging South Vietnam, "Don't sign anything yet. Wait until Nixon wins, you'll get a better deal." When Johnson heard this through FBI wiretaps and NSA intel, he exploded, calling it treason. But instead of going public, Johnson stayed silent, Exposing the evidence would also expose government eavesdropping. And here's the bitter paradox. A president accused his opponent of betraying the nation but couldn't say it out loud. Nixon went on to win the election. The war dragged on for years, costing tens of thousands more lives. Johnson's silence carried a blood price. The hostility between them never thawed. During the transition, when Nixon visited Johnson's Texas ranch, the two men barely looked at each other. Their handshake was stiff, like a staged wedding photo posed for the camera but hollow inside. From a historian's angle, this wasn't just a personal grudge. It was a clash of ego and power that shaped a nation's fate. Johnson wanted to leave with dignity. Nixon wanted the presidency at any cost. In the middle stood American soldiers and millions of Vietnamese civilians who paid the price. Darkly ironic, Johnson's thunderous word, treason, echoed like a storm but disappeared into classified files. History isn't only written by what leaders say aloud. Sometimes it's defined by the secrets they choose to keep. Truman vs. Eisenhower and Nixon. A Brotherhood broken, 1952-1974. During World War II, Harry Truman saw Dwight D. Eisenhower as the very model of a hero. As president, Truman even hinted, if Eisenhower ever wanted to enter politics, he'd back him all the way. To Truman, Ike was the perfect future leader of America. Respected general, steady hand, trusted brother in arms. But politics isn't war. In 1952, Eisenhower ran for president as a Republican, taking aim at Truman's legacy. What infuriated Truman wasn't just party rivalry, but Ike's silence when his closest ally, General George C. Marshall, the man behind the Marshall Plan and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, was smeared by Senator Joseph McCarthy as soft on communism. Truman expected Ike to defend Marshall in a campaign speech. Instead, Eisenhower cut the passage, bowing to political advisors. For Truman, that was betrayal. The friendship cracked. Truman lashed out during the campaign, sneering that Eisenhower knows as much about politics as a pig knows about Sunday.
We need to move quickly.
Funny line, sure, but underneath was deep disappointment. The war hero had chosen expedience over principle. And then came Richard Nixon, Ike's running mate. To Truman, Nixon embodied everything rotten in politics. Ruthless, opportunistic, a man who lied as easily as breathing. Truman once said Nixon could lie out of both sides of his mouth at the same time. Not just an insult, a moral indictment. Here's the paradox. A president who once treated generals like brothers ended up estranged because of politics. The bond of the battlefield couldn't survive the storms of an election. Eisenhower marched into the White House, but left behind a broken friendship and a predecessor bitter to his dying day. Hoover vs. FDR when a nation was in crisis, and the presidents went cold, 1932-1933. Winter 1932. America was drowning in the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing, millions were out of work, and bread lines stretched for blocks. In the middle of the wreckage stood Herbert Hoover, the stern, principled incumbent, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, the smiling Democratic challenger with his New Deal promise. The election wasn't close. Roosevelt crushed Hoover. But here was the problem. In those days, inaugurations didn't happen until March. That meant 4 long months of power vacuum while the financial system teetered on collapse. Hoover begged Roosevelt to join him in reassuring the public to issue joint statements that might calm the markets. He wanted the image of 2 presidents, one purpose. Roosevelt refused. "It's your responsibility, not mine," he said coolly. Translation, why tie myself to your sinking ship? So the 2 men sat near each other in silence while the country slid deeper into crisis. The frost reached its peak on Inauguration Day. Tradition dictated that the outgoing and incoming presidents share a carriage ride to the Capitol. The photo of Hoover and Roosevelt, seated stiffly side by side, not even glancing at each other, became an instant symbol. Americans could see it plain as day. They despised each other, even as the nation desperately needed unity. Here's the bitter paradox. A country starving for action was stuck in a dead zone of ego and protocol. One man clung to his honor, the other waited to start fresh on day one. In the meantime, hundreds of banks failed. History remembers, sometimes a refused handshake isn't just bad manners. It can shake the entire economy. Roosevelt vs. Taft when friendship turned to feud, 1908-1912. Not every political rivalry begins with hatred. Some, like Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, start with friendship, and that makes the fall all the more brutal. Roosevelt saw Taft as his right-hand man, so loyal that in 1908 he basically handed him the keys to the White House. In Roosevelt's mind, Taft would carry on the mission, busting monopolies, protecting workers, conserving America's wild lands. A gentler version of Teddy himself. But once in office, Taft showed his own colors, cautious, conservative, deferential to business and the old guard. From afar, Roosevelt watched his protege dismantle parts of his legacy. Each decision felt like a stab in the back. By 1912, Teddy had had enough. He came storming out of retirement, not to fight the Democrats, but to destroy the very man he had once elevated. The campaign of 1912 turned into a bare-knuckle brawl. Roosevelt mocked Taft as a flubdub and a puzzle wit. Taft, usually mild, finally snapped back, calling Roosevelt a honeyfuggler, old-timey slang for a smooth-talking deceiver. Americans literally had to grab dictionaries to keep up, but the message was crystal clear. This friendship was dead. Roosevelt even founded a new party, the Bull Moose Party, just to take Taft down. The result? They split the Republican vote and handed an easy victory to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Taft, humiliated, carried only 2 states. Friends later recalled him breaking down in tears, lamenting that he'd lost not just the presidency, but his best friend. And here's the cruel paradox. Roosevelt's hatred burned hottest because his expectations had been highest. It wasn't a small policy difference, it was a shattered bond. From warm embraces in 1908 to venom in 1912, one of America's greatest friendships had become one of its fiercest political feuds. Andrew Johnson vs. Ulysses S. Grant Reconstruction drama, 1867-1869. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865, America faced the enormous task of stitching the Union back together. Into Lincoln's shoes stepped Andrew Johnson, a Southern Unionist who suddenly found himself president. Instead of carrying on Lincoln's legacy, Johnson granted sweeping pardons to ex-Confederate leaders, letting them slip back into power. To the radical Republicans in Congress, this wasn't reconciliation, it was betrayal. Standing opposite Johnson was Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero who had crushed Robert E. Lee. Grant threw his weight behind Congress, demanding strict Reconstruction and protections for newly freed slaves. Instead of teamwork, President and General dove into open combat. The clash came to a head with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, an ally of Congress. Johnson tried to fire Stanton, but under the brand new Tenure of Office Act, he needed Senate approval. To dodge the law, Johnson pressured Grant to act as interim secretary. Grant reluctantly agreed, but when the Senate reinstated Stanton, he promptly stepped aside. Johnson exploded, accusing Grant of betrayal in a public letter. Grant calmly fired back with his own letter, exposing the truth. In the court of public opinion, Johnson was the one humiliated. When Grant won the presidency in 1868, tradition called for him and Johnson to ride together to the inauguration. Grant flat-out refused. Johnson, in true Adams at 4 a.m. fashion, refused to attend at all. He sat in the White House, signing meaningless papers just to avoid seeing his successor. Here's the bitter irony. Johnson, a Southerner loyal to the Union, ended up undermining Lincoln's emancipation legacy. Grant, the reluctant politician, emerged as the defender of civil rights. Their supposed bond as comrades collapsed, and Reconstruction, the most fragile healing process in American history, turned into a political soap opera. John Quincy Adams vs. Andrew Jackson, the corrupt bargain election, 1824-1828. The year 1824 gave Americans a four-way showdown. Andrew Jackson, the rough-hewn war hero of New Orleans; John Quincy Adams, the polished diplomat; Henry Clay, the great compromiser from Kentucky; and William Crawford. Jackson won the popular vote and the most electoral votes, but fell short of a majority. Under the Constitution, the decision went to the House of Representatives. Enter Henry Clay. As Speaker of the House, he swung support to Adams. Soon after, Adams named Clay Secretary of State. Americans didn't need Sherlock Holmes to connect the dots. Corrupt bargain, they cried. Jackson believed the presidency had been stolen from him, and he stewed on it for 4 long years. The rematch in 1828 turned into one of the dirtiest campaigns in U.S. history. Adams's supporters smeared Jackson as a violent, uneducated brute and accused his wife Rachel of bigamy. Jackson's side fired back that Adams had pimped out American girls to the Russian Tsar while serving as ambassador. This wasn't just mudslinging, it was a swamp. Jackson won in a landslide, but personal tragedy struck. Rachel died just weeks before the inauguration. Jackson blamed the vicious attacks for her death. At her funeral, he swore he would never forgive his enemies. For Jackson, politics and vengeance fused into one. The irony? A backroom handshake between Adams and Clay unleashed a new era of popular, emotional, and divisive politics. Jackson turned his rage into a movement, the foundation of today's Democratic Party. In a sense, without the corrupt bargain, American politics might have taken a much calmer path. Dark humor aside, that secret deal was basically America's first not my president moment. Just 200 years too early for Twitter. Adams vs. Jefferson, from soulmates to enemies, and back again, 1796-1826. Picture Paris in the 1780. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, sipping wine, swapping Enlightenment ideas, and dreaming of a free America. They were the revolutionary dream team. Adams, the sharp diplomat; Jefferson, the philosopher-statesman. Then came politics. In 1796, Adams won the presidency, while Jefferson, his rival, ended up as vice president under the old rules. Imagine having to live with your ex after a breakup. By the election of 1800, things exploded. Jefferson's allies hired journalist James Callender to brand Adams, a hideous hermaphroditical character. Adams's camp called Jefferson mean-spirited and low-lived. When Jefferson finally won, Adams stormed out of Washington at 4 a.m., becoming the first president to skip his successor's inauguration. The friendship looked broken forever. But history loves a plot twist. Years later, a mutual friend nudged them to reconnect. From 1812 on, Adams and Jefferson began a rich correspondence. Their letters, hundreds of them, debated philosophy, religion, and memories of the Revolution. Two old lions, once bitter enemies, now rediscovered their bond. And then came the final irony. On July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, both Adams and Jefferson died on the same day. Hollywood couldn't have scripted it better. The paradox is irresistible. Friends turned into foes, then reconciled as kindred spirits. America's story began with their feud, but their reconciliation proved that history isn't just about conflict. It's also about healing. And the kicker? They skipped each other's inaugurations, but in the end, they met up on the birthday of the nation. If that's not historical irony, what is? Looking back across 2 centuries of president versus president, a strange picture emerges. American politics isn't just laws, congressmen, and the Constitution. It's also raw human emotion, ego, anger, disappointment, betrayal. Some rivalries sparked reform. Jackson's fury over being cheated birthed the modern 2-party system. Some rivalries delivered justice. Grant's clash with Johnson helped protect the rights of freedmen. Some rivalries deepened the pain. Hoover and FDR's frosty standoff worsened a banking collapse, and some began as jokes, like Obama roasting Trump at a dinner, only to explode into seismic policy shifts. Here's the paradox. What should have been private grudges often turned into national turning points. A cold stare, a vicious letter, or a sharp one-liner at a banquet could carry as much weight as an act of Congress. History reminds us that presidents are human too, and that humanity, for better or worse, is what makes America's story so riveting. Messy, unfair, sometimes ridiculous, but always full of lessons. So here's my question for you. Out of all these rivalries, which feud left the deepest mark on America? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because who knows, 100 years from now, some historian might be quoting your words as testimony of this era. And if you think presidential history is nothing but bitter squabbles, just wait for the next video. We'll dive into the weirdest things ever banned from the White House, from broccoli to drones to, yes, women wearing pants. Trust me, when it comes to presidential drama, the supply has never run out.